name is Catherine, as Kathy said, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Arizona. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that shortly. But today I wanted to begin by showing this image here, which I think is going to give you an introduction about what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is looking at the electrification of transport and the impact on the environment, and all these other factors that we need to take into consideration, including renewable energy systems. So I thought I'd give you a brief agenda for today's presentation. So I'm going to begin with giving some contextual information about myself and the UK, and also give you a quick geography lesson. I'm then going to give you a bit of a methodology of how I took my approaches. I'm then going to give you a bit of a run through of hydrogen and electric cars, buses and trains for the UK. I'm then going to discuss the environmental impacts of transport and these challenges that we're going to face to integrate electric and hydrogen transportation. I'm then going to give you a brief discussion on how I got to Arizona and what I do here, and how my previous work actually fits in really nicely with what I'm hoping to do. And hopefully, even with these slight issues at the start, we're going to have plenty of time for some questions. So firstly, some context and a bit of a geography lesson. So I did my PhD and my undergraduate degree at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland in environmental science. And today my presentation is going to discuss what the research I did. During my PhD, I won several fellowships, which allowed me to visit Tsinghua University in China, where I was investigating the electrification of cars and the impact on the environment, and was able to draw comparisons and parallels with the UK. The year after, I also got a visiting researcher position at Kyoto University in Japan, where I was looking at the electrification of rail systems and how we could apply these lessons learned to the rest of the UK. After graduating my PhD, I spent a year as an energy policy researcher at University College Dublin in Ireland, where I was working with the Irish government and helping them look at ways in which they could continue to subsidise electric transport. So in this case, we were looking at whether they should continue to subsidise plug-in electric vehicles or not, and whether they should move towards battery electric vehicles, and whether that would meet their emission targets long term. And now I'm here at the University of Arizona, working as an urban and climate action postdoctoral research fellow, but a bit more about that later. So, geography. So my PhD, as I said, was investigating the impact of the electrification of transport to reduce carbon emissions on natural capital. The UK is a collection of 4 countries: England, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, and has a population of about 67 million, which, for some contextual reasons, has about the same population as California and Texas combined. For those interested, I'm from Scotland and Edinburgh, which is just about here, and it has a population of around 5.5 million, so around the same as South Carolina. And the reason that I decided to look at the UK as a whole is because the way that the electricity network in the UK works is it's very interconnected. So we share electricity from within the 4 countries, and we also share electricity from our European neighbours, so with France and the Netherlands and Northern Republic of Ireland as well. So it actually makes it very difficult to break up the electricity network. And the main target, what we were trying to achieve, is to look at how we can meet net zero by 2050, as that is the new policy recommendation in the UK. And one of the ways that we're beginning to look at this is through decarbonising transport and energy generation, because these remain the leading contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. And one way to do this within the EU is to reduce tailpipe emissions, which are predominant within EU policy. I just also want to stress that my PhD research was done before Brexit, so that was part of the basis of why we were looking at EU context. And the way that the UK government has approached this is to ban and phase out all new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. At the start of my PhD research, this was 2040, but it's actually been brought forward twice to a 2030 deadline. And the aim and target of my research was to look at what a level of emission reduction can be observed, and how this transition towards low emission transport actually impact the environment, and how can we minimize the environmental impact, and what are these trade-offs likely to be. So for some context, a way that researchers address the environmental impacts of electrification of transport is looking at the impact on natural capital and ecosystem services. So natural capital refers to focusing on the living and non-living components of the ecosystem. So other than the people and what they manufacture, but what they contribute to the generation of goods and services and for the value for people. Whereas ecosystem services are the conditions and processes of ecosystems they generate, which benefit an individual. So as a result, ecosystem services and natural capital are linked. So an example of this is forests are a component of natural capital, whilst the timber itself might be the ecosystem service that it provides for the individuals. And if ecosystem services are used at an unsustainable rate, then the stocks of natural capital which provide them may be depleted, thus negatively impacting the environment. Therefore, when we're assessing energy demand and its subsequent footprints, it's therefore key to think about how we can think about these things within a low carbon transport. So some additional UK transportation information to sort of set the scene. Again, this is sort of pre-pandemic times, but back in 2018, there was 808 billion passenger kilometres travelled across the year, and 83% of these journeys were made by cars, vans, and taxis. So it's a lot of sort of small road transport, which is not particularly great for the environment. Alternatively, public transport, there was 80.3 billion passenger transport journeys on public transport, with 3.2 of these made by rail, which has actually increased by about 170% since the 1960s, and 4.8 billion journeys made on local bus services, which is actually down since the 1960s. And a lot of these journeys, so about a quarter, were made for leisure purposes. Again, pre-pandemic, when we could go out and see our friends and go shopping, etc. And I thought I'd also give you some information on what the UK electricity generation mix currently looks like. So this is what it looks like back in 2019. And compared to previous years, the amount of coal use has actually decreased, and the share of renewable energy has begun to increase slowly. Also, the share of nuclear energy actually decreased, which is likely due to outages and ongoing maintenance. And I find it quite an interesting one to discuss because Scotland are actually phasing out nuclear energy in favour of other types of renewables, whereas England are actually expanding their nuclear energy sources, which is something I'll talk about a wee bit later in my presentation. And using the energy that we've generated, there's different methods on how to generate hydrogen, which is going to be another key component of my presentation. So there's 5 different types of hydrogen generation. There's green hydrogen, which is generated using electrolysis. So it's the most environmentally friendly way to make hydrogen because the byproducts are only water and oxygen. And it's a renewable source, so you can use solar and wind to help generate it. And that's how the basis of most of my projections are used. However, green hydrogen is difficult because it's not available on such a widely commercial scale. So a lot of research has been done using other methods, including grey, blue, and brown hydrogen. So grey hydrogen is used or generated from natural gas produced from fossil fuels. And so it bridges this gap to wean off individuals using fossil fuels as we move towards electrolysis. It's the same kind of process with coal gasification. Again, it's an unsustainable method of transport and of energy generation, and it produces brown hydrogen. One of the ways in which you can help decarbonize that as far as possible is using carbon capture and storage. However, it's not a solution, it's an interim method in order to capture CO2 to store it as opposed to letting it being released into the atmosphere. And white hydrogen is very similar to green hydrogen within that sense of it could be produced from potential renewable energy sources. It just depends on the makeup of the national grid. I'm going to quickly give you a bit of an overview of the methodology that I've used. So at the start of my PhD, there was sort of multiple ways in which you could think about how to project the carbon emissions of transport. So we began by using the Transport Energy Air Pollution Model, also known as TEAM. And this model is a life cycle analysis model. So from the manufacture of the vehicle right until the end of life. In the UK, the average vehicle has a life expectancy, or your personal vehicle has a life expectancy of about 13 years. However, the problems with this type of model is that it requires a significant amount of data. We were able to use data from historic data to project values going forward in terms of the amount of the distance people were going to travel, etc. However, it made it very difficult to be able to compare this information with other countries. So we had to think about how can we compare emission levels. So we began to create an operating emissions model, which was the model which fell under the EU policy scenarios, which I mentioned at the start, because that's what their target was to reduce operating emissions. So we wanted to make sure that that was also a viable option. So we compared this model with the operations emissions model to see what the emission differences are likely to be. So our results, which is from this paper here, sort of highlight that using a life cycle analysis model compared to an operations emissions model, emission levels were about 30% higher. But as the vehicle technology improved itself, both sets of emissions fell, and the emission levels from a life cycle analysis were about 30% higher than an operations emission model. And so we took that into consideration moving forward. So this was our operations emissions model. I know it looks a bit scary, but I'm going to talk you through it so you all understand it by the end of the presentation. So we focused on the operating emissions. So this took into consideration different factors, including the distance traveled and the estimated number of vehicles, which we took from historic data to be able to project forward. We also wanted to consider the vehicle proportion, because that also altered depending on what country you're in. We have about a 60-40 split in the UK, but I also used this model in China when I was there, and there was a 98% to 2% sort of comparison between diesel and petrol vehicles. So we needed to make sure that the emissions were able to reflect this. We also looked at the carbon intensity of electricity generation, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, as we wanted to make sure that that was representative of different scenarios that the UK is likely to face going forward. I also wanted to mention that we included a correctional factor for energy production inefficiencies, and this was because about 17% of energy in the UK is lost during the transmission phases. So we needed to make sure that that was factored in. And they're sort of the key components of this model. And as I mentioned, we looked at the carbon intensity of electricity generation in order to make this going forward. So in order to do this, we took 4 different scenarios, which were made by the National Grid. And our National Grid sort of looks at the whole of the UK and helps with sort of that modelling. So it was a relatively stable way to look at how things are going to move forward, because they're sort of the people that are in charge of that. So there was 4 different scenarios. There was the green scenario, which is the 2-degree scenario, and that reflects the UK meeting the Paris Agreement targets of their 2 degrees Celsius. There is the yellow scenario, which is known as steady progression, and that looks at continual levels of progress at current levels. So this is probably the most realistic scenario with the UK, as things are sort of moving along going forward. We also had the community renewables, which is the pink scenario, which looks at little communities introducing their own schemes and their own sort of solar panels within local businesses. However, it's sort of a slightly slower process, as things are sort of a little disjointed. And then the blue scenario is the consumer revolution scenario, which is where things are sort of beginning to be introduced at a slightly later date. So moving towards 2040, when people are going to integrate electric vehicles. Again, research was done a few years ago when their initial targets were 2040. So it's a bit of a slower process. So using that information for the carbon intensity of electricity generation, we then put that into our model to project the operating emissions of different transport types. So I'm firstly going to speak about electric and hydrogen cars. So these are your personal vehicles. So this image shows the projected carbon dioxide emissions from the small, medium, and large personal vehicles from 2020 to 2050. So the black line at the bottom indicates what the emission levels would be if we were going to meet our net zero target. So as you can see, even if we think about taking into consideration technological advances in terms of the vehicles themselves, we're really going to struggle in the UK to meet our net zero targets if we're just focusing on conventionally fueled cars, your petrol and diesel cars. So with this information, we needed to think about alternatives. What would happen if we introduced electric and hydrogen cars into the transport mix? So this image shows the 4 different scenarios. So your blue, pink, yellow, and green. And what I want to concentrate on is the green scenario. So if all cars in the UK were 100% electric between 2020 and 2050, this is the maximum level of emissions that could be produced, potentially. However, using the 4 different electricity scenarios, the only scenario that we would meet our 2-degree target is under the 2-degree green scenario, which means a substantial effort needs to be made within the transport sector and within the electricity sector, as they can't work in silos to meet our emission reduction targets. However, this is an unrealistic situation. We're not going to be 100% electric right now. We're beginning to phase in our targets. So we needed to think about realistic scenarios. So we began by looking at what would happen if we introduced electric vehicles in 2050, phasing them in for a 2030 start date. And this is what our results highlighted. So although emission levels are difficult and we're unlikely to meet our targets, we meet them in our 2-degree scenario again, which is the bottom green box, but it's a lot later. We also did this sort of analysis with different integration dates, and the earlier we integrate these electric vehicles, the lower the cumulative emissions. Therefore, it's something that we need to think about, and why I'm very happy that the UK has brought forward their electric vehicle integration dates from 2040 down to 2030. So we also began to think about what would happen if we wanted to integrate hydrogen transport. Now, I know you're thinking, why would we want to do this when hydrogen transport is going to require additional stages to produce hydrogen? Well, hydrogen vehicles tend to have a much larger range than electric vehicles. So some people feel that there's range anxiety with the average electric vehicle only traveling about 200 kilometers a day. However, in the UK, the average person only travels about 40 kilometers a day. However, people want that peace of mind that if there's an emergency, they can just get in their car and go. So although it's a slower market, there are hydrogen vehicles available. So we did the same analysis of the hydrogen vehicles. So this is a situation with 100% hydrogen vehicles in the UK, based on the 4 electricity scenarios. As you can see, none of these scenarios meet our net zero targets, and none of them fall below the black line. The 2-degree scenario is close, but unfortunately does not meet it. But again, it's likely a combination of these 2 situations that are likely going to have to occur for us to move forward. And we then looked at earlier integration, and again, similar results. If we bring things forward, cumulative emissions are likely to decrease. I also just wanted to briefly mention that there's different ways to integrate vehicles. So as I mentioned at the start, I spent some time in China. And in the UK, we have this phasing out approach of how we're tackling integrating electric vehicles. And that includes phasing out current vehicles and slowly integrating in electric vehicles, so making room in the network. Whereas China have taken a slightly different approach, and it's called leapfrogging, which is how they've avoided pollution-intensive stages of development by encouraging new consumers simply to purchase electric vehicles off the bat, as opposed to having that additional step of buying conventionally fueled vehicles in the interim. So if you want to read more about it, that's our paper there, and it's a really interesting concept moving forward. So I'm now going to briefly go into electric and hydrogen buses. So again, this is a bit of a lot of information on the slide, but this slide shows what the projected carbon dioxide emissions for conventionally fueled buses and cars are. So we know that cars aren't going to meet our net zero target, even if they're 100% electric. So we need to think about how we're going to integrate public transport into the mix. So one of the ways we did that was looking at what the different capacity levels are going to be in terms of your conventionally fueled bus and your conventionally fueled car. So we assumed that a 100% capacity bus would have 80 passengers, and a 100% capacity car is likely to have 4 passengers. And we were able to directly compare the level of emissions per kilometre travelled per person. And at full capacity, bus emissions were about 1.8 times lower than cars per person. So it highlights that buses were more environmentally friendly per person per kilometre travelled. But what I wanted to highlight here were the red lines. So the red full line is the buses, and the red dashed line is the cars. And I wanted to bring these to your attention because the average car in the UK only has about 1.6 passengers per journey. So naturally we rounded that up to 2, and it shows that actually buses at 50% capacity were much lower than cars at 50% capacity. So that's one of the things we think about moving forward, is how can we think about getting people on public transport. But we're not done there. We need to think about how can we lower these emissions further. So we looked at the carbon dioxide emissions for electric buses using the 4 different scenarios. I don't know where my net zero line has gone, which is normally a black line here, but what I can tell you is under the 2-degree scenario, so the green line, our emissions fell below that. So we're only going to meet our emission targets if we're really rapid into our decarbonisation of transport. And we did the same thing when we looked at hydrogen buses. And although emission levels were higher, the emission levels using hydrogen buses were still lower than what we would be if we were looking at just conventionally fueled cars. So we need to think about these things. And Scotland has a very big, I know I'm talking about Scotland here, I'm sorry, I'm passionate about my hometown, but Scotland has a rural population where about a fifth of people live in difficult places to access. So hydrogen buses would be able to be that type of connection, bringing people into sort of cities, etc., because they have the range that electric vehicles don't have. So electric vehicles will be much more suited to smaller cities. And so that was using the electrolysis method for hydrogen production. We also looked at what would happen if we used the other methods of hydrogen production. So that was your grey hydrogen, your brown hydrogen, and your blue hydrogen. So your grey and your brown hydrogen generation were the two methods that were the least sustainable because they were using coal and natural gas. And as you can see here, the level of emissions is actually significantly higher than what it was when we were looking at the methods of electrolysis. However, if we include things like carbon capture and storage, the level of emissions actually decreases. However, carbon capture and storage cannot be a solution because we're storing that carbon dioxide underground. So we need to think about longer term solutions. I'm now going to quickly talk to you about hydrogen electric trains. So this image is sort of similar to one of our previous images, where we're looking at conventionally fueled trains in the UK between 2017 and 2050. Now, trains are one of these methods of transport that's often considered green. They don't produce a lot of emissions, comparatively against other transport types. However, if we don't think about how we're going to improve the rolling stock and the trains themselves, emission levels are going to remain static. And we need to think about long term, if we're encouraging people to move from petrol and diesel vehicles onto sustainable methods of transport, how are we going to make sure that these methods are going to be able to be long term and low carbon? So this image again shows that based on current technological advances and what we currently have, emission levels are going to remain static. The UK announced recently that they're going to phase out all diesel trains by 2040, which leaves room in the market for your electric and hydrogen train integration. However, again, that's quite a delayed target, so we need to think about what we're going to do now and what's the best solution moving forward. So we looked at the 4 different electricity generation scenarios for electric trains. And our results indicated, similar to buses, that under the 2-degree scenario, we're probably going to meet our targets. However, again, it's an unrealistic scenario because we're not there yet. But that's the direction that we need to think about moving into. And we did the same sort of situation again with hydrogen. Emission levels were higher, again, but we need to think about how we're going to move forward and integrating 2-degree scenarios, decarbonized electricity is our way forward. We also looked at the different methods of hydrogen production again, so I just wanted to quickly go through this slide, and it shows that, if we're going to think about producing hydrogen using natural gas and coal gasification, emission levels are going to be higher. However, they're still lower than what they would be if we were just using conventional fuel transport. So we need to think about, if we're going to move down that route, how can we decarbonize this further? And that's through blue hydrogen. But again, it's not the solution because it's using carbon capture and storage, which is not commercially available yet. I'm now going to give a brief discussion about the environmental impacts of the transportation sector. And one of the things that we did was look at how much energy we're going to need for 100% electric and hydrogen cars, buses, and trains. What does that look like? So we split up using our scenarios. We looked at renewables, which we were strictly considering solar and wind because they're the sort of most popular methods of renewables in the UK. And we looked at nuclear power stations. We looked at sort of the average nuclear power station. However, in our next slide, we also think about the newer technologies power stations, as they're quite popular in England. And then we looked at coal within our fossil fuels. So as this image shows, that the generating capacity we would need for 100% electric and hydrogen transport is actually quite substantial. And how we're going about that moving forward is, where are we going to put this energy? Because that's going to directly impact the environment in terms of biodiversity and wildlife. So we need to think about that strategically. When we're thinking about renewables, we're also thinking onshore and offshore wind, as we have quite a big coastline. And so can we incorporate more offshore wind, but how does that impact marine biodiversity? It's all these factors that need to be thought about together in a holistic view, opposed to siloed. So this slide looks at the total area that would be required in kilometers squared to get that energy and put it on the ground or on the sea. And again, there'd be so much higher land area required for hydrogen transport because there's these additional steps that would be required in terms of generating hydrogen. And we would also need some sort of substantial area required for electric transport. So thinking about these things forward, we need to think about this sort of sooner rather than later if we're going to meet our decarbonization targets. And even though that I've just mentioned some challenges, there's also other challenges that need to be considered moving forward. For example, the cost, upfront costs. How are we going to pay for these new technologies? So the average conventionally fueled bus in the UK is about £250,000. A new hydrogen bus is double that. People are more inclined to buy the cheaper version of the transport method, especially when they're not considering the infrastructure that's going to need to be put in place, how we're going to generate the hydrogen, where is it going to go. So these upfront costs are going to have to take a bit of a toll. We also need to think about energy. How are we going to store it? Energy storage is not vastly available right now, but thinking about these things long term is something that we need to do. For example, most people, when they come home after a hard day of work, are wanting to plug in their electric vehicle and just forget about it. But if everybody in the UK does that, there's going to be a massive impact on demand. So can we introduce things like smart meters, which will automatically charge your vehicle at 3 o'clock in the morning when the demand is lower? However, are people going to suffer that range anxiety that's going to be associated with that? Because what if there's an emergency in the night and they just want to get up and go? These factors need to be thought about as well. Additionally, travel behavior. And we need to encourage travel behavior. And I'm going to go into that in a wee bit more detail in the next slide, as I'm going to briefly mention COVID and the impacts there. But how are we going to encourage these people to choose buses and trains and not continue using the public transport network? London is a really great example of this, where they've introduced an Oyster card, which allows people to move from different modes of public transport, so they can use the same card for the buses and the trains, and there's a capped rate at the end of the day, so you can only spend about $5, and you can use it as many times as you want within a day. Can we incorporate something like this across the UK? They did introduce something similar for COP26 in Glasgow. I don't know if it's here to stay, fingers crossed. And as I also mentioned, are there other technologies? For example, what about carbon capture and storage? Is this going to be an interim solution, or can we think about these things moving forward? Although there's likely to be technological advances moving forward as we go towards our targets, we can't rely solely on these future technologies. We need to think about now. And as I mentioned, I just wanted to briefly talk about the implications of COVID-19. At the beginning of the lockdown back in March 2020, transport emissions decreased substantially. However, that also directly impacted public transport. People were less inclined to use public transport, and as a result, people were using their own personal vehicles to reduce the risks of catching COVID-19. So not only do we need to encourage people to use public transport, we also need to think about how we can get people back on public transport. Many people are now having the option to work from home and only needing to go into the office once or twice a week, which means people are choosing the most cost-effective and convenient method of transport, which likely is their own personal vehicle. So how are we going to think about encouraging these people back long term? And so the journey continues. This is some sort of brief highlights of what our research showed, was that technological improvements cannot be solely relied upon. So when we're looking at conventionally fueled vehicles, emission levels are not going to fall far enough in order to meet our targets. Electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles from 2020, 100% are not realistic. We need to think about integrating sustainable methods of transport as early as possible. And we need to think about encouraging this transition towards electric and hydrogen trains and buses sooner rather than later. We also need to think about how we're going to optimize our sustainable energy situations in terms of ensuring renewable energy is placed in the most sort of cost-effective and sustainable place to make sure it doesn't negatively impact natural capital and ecosystem services. And we need to think about how we can find the money in order to make sure we invest in the right places. And all of this is going to be discussed in our upcoming book, which I'm just giving a wee plug for now, where we're talking about transitioning to net zero and how we need to think about transitioning to public transport. In this book, we also discuss the impact on freight, so your trucks, delivering goods and services, as well as we also talk about aviation and the impact there. But how did I get to Arizona? So I wanted to quickly talk about how does this history actually fit in nicely with the job I'm doing here. And it's not just for the life experiences and the food and the hikes and everything. So my postdoctoral research fellowship is part of the University Climate Change Coalition. And this is a consortium of about 23 Research One universities across Canada, the US, and Mexico. And it's about building relationships within the universities, with the community, and networking within universities as well in order to help make sure cities can meet their climate change targets. So my role with my postdoctoral research fellowship is working with the city of Tucson, and we're mapping out climate action goals and needs for the city of Tucson to meet their climate change target for climate neutrality for 2030. And this role involves building formal partnerships with the city itself, as well as within the communities, to make sure that key climate action priorities are met. And so far, I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what I've been up to, as I've only been in the post for a few months, but I'm hoping this will be a nice introduction so that you're all desperate to come back for a presentation in 6 months' time to learn about what I've actually been doing in place. So I've been able to attend, as I've been invited to the City of Tucson's Climate Advisory Council meetings, which have got individuals from across the City of Tucson in various different roles working with the city itself to meet their targets. I've been assessing current US climate action plans to see what other cities are doing, to see what lessons have been learned and what we can apply. We've been looking at what are the different gaps or current terminology that's being used in these climate action plans, what can we think about moving forward. And if there are keywords that are not defined clearly, or we want to make sure that what we do actually meets the definitions that we're setting, we want to be able to make sure that that's clear. So we also looked at the introduction of Tucson's greenhouse gas inventory to make sure that the terminology is introduced, defined correctly, and incorporated. And finally, we've been developing a framework to make sure that these key phrases and terminology that we have identified is applied within the city's climate action plan as they're beginning to develop it. And finally, just looking back on everything that we've discussed today, I was hoping that there will be enough time for some questions. Thank you.
So people online can't hear us if we have.
No, I can repeat the question.
Okay. So I'll start, unless there's one online. Okay. So I guess the question I'd ask is, what's the most striking difference you've seen between U.S. transportation conditions and UK?
So the question was asking what differences I've seen between the UK and the US in terms of transport. And I guess I've grown up in the Luxor. I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, where we have a really great bus network. And I know that's not the same in the rest of the UK, but it's something that I've grown up using quite regularly. So that was a bit of a difference moving here, and the bus services aren't quite as available as what they were. I know in Europe there's been a lot of moving towards a 15-minute city, so being able to have everything within 15 minutes within a walking distance or a biking distance. And I've seen that as a bit of a challenge here because I think Tucson's quite a new city, which has made it sort of looking at more of a car-based city as opposed to a public transport city. But saying that, I know the city of Tucson have just purchased 5 new electric buses, which is very exciting, which I think are going to be introduced early next year into the transport network. So hopefully that will begin to think about encouraging individuals to use public transport. They also have the added benefit of, until I think it's still the end of the year, that the public transport here is still for free, which I don't think they did at home. But I found that as a really great way to get around, having recently moved here in person.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Others in the room have some questions?
I have a question about the ecosystem services and natural capital aspects that you were talking about. And we're focusing on the electricity generation, but I was sort of curious about the energy storage side of things and batteries and electric cars. there, perhaps, outside of the UK, where the materials are being mined, or, did that consideration kind of come into your analysis at all?
Unfortunately, not too much. It was something I was looking. Oh, sorry. Yes. So the question was looking at, did I consider thinking about the implications of sort of natural capital in terms of the life cycle analysis moving forward? And it was something that we began to look at, but unfortunately, I did not have time. But it was something that we began to think about because realistically, the UK doesn't manufacture a lot of their cars. A lot of them are imported. So within the model, life cycle analysis model, it was factored in there, but we didn't look at it from the operations emissions model. But it would be something that we were interested in expanding moving forward, because that's going to have a significant impact, because most of our cars are imported and built elsewhere, and the components that are being built elsewhere are coming from different countries. So it's actually quite a big collective approach. But unfortunately, we only have 4 years for a PhD in Scotland.
Any questions? Although, so we actually virtually met briefly, and I came over from planning. My personal expertise is public health and transportation, the behavior part. And I struck again by the extent to which you and I should get together and figure out how to But, one of the challenges that I observe in the U.S. is that we still have, we're still bifurcated in terms of how we think about climate change and whether it's really important. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing, and you've been here, very long, but seeing a shift. One of the reasons why I was down the health path was that was a little bit more of a universal value 10 years ago when I was doing my PhD than the carbon. But are those being discussed in things like the Tucson advisory setting, or in other areas where in the U.S. and North America?
So do you mean the health?
Yeah, I mean, so how much are you seeing like a shift towards like carbon of carbon rather than as the value, rather than like tinkering on the edges with, say, health or justice altogether or environment?
So I was looking at that question, was asking about the side of is the UK considering sort of health within their transport side of things? And I think it's definitely becoming more prominent in the news, especially in sort of bigger cities like London. I've definitely seen a few articles recently where unfortunately people have been directly impacted and unfortunately passed away as a result of, the carbon emissions as a result. So I think it's definitely one of these topics where people are beginning to wake up. I think it was really great that COP was in Glasgow, Scotland this year. So I think that was really sort of an eye-opener in order to sort of open up this sort of conversation with a lot of individuals, because I don't know if how well it is discussed, as I'm not directly looked at some of the health side of things, but I have noticed having conversations with people here is definitely much more of a larger concern. And I've heard some of the studies I think some of the people in CAPLA have done that have been really interesting, looking at assessing the carbon emissions, etc. But I'm not sure, based on my background, if there's been a lot of discussions based in the UK, but I assume there has been, and there's definitely universities that are looking into it.
And also a quick follow-up when we talk after, but, some of the plug-and-play modeling, health modeling, on top of transportation mode shifts is basically what it is, physical activities, are actually being developed in the UK.
Okay.
And so we should talk about how to, and they're public, and that we could maybe do around on that, because it's really taking the assumptions you have about the state and those choices from public transport versus single, vehicle. Let's chat.
Yes, let's do. I have some business cards somewhere over there in case I miss you, but I'm sure we'll have time. Is there any other questions? Yes.
Mentioned the city of Tucson being very cost-centric. What do you foresee being the biggest challenge looking at the city on electrifying transportation? Maybe it's that the sprawl, or maybe there are other factors.
So that question was looking at one of the bigger challenges within within the city of Tucson, and what I find is a potential challenge. And I think it's got to be travel behavior. I think that's got to be a key challenge that we're going to have to overcome moving forward. And it's how we get people, as I mentioned, onto public transport, especially during COVID times. I think that's going to be a particular challenge moving forward. I'm really impressed by the streetcar that you have here, and I know that there's discussions about extending that all the way to the airport, which I think is a really great initiative, because I think that will really help students, etc. Although I know they're then going to fly, but getting there is a bit more sustainable. But there's been a lot of studies that I've read that have sort of highlighted that if you can encourage more sustainable behavior within young people, so targeting the universities and people younger than that, then they're more likely to follow suit growing up with how they sort of feel or adapt to transport. I think there was a really great study in Japan where they gave all these students the speedometer walking thing, and by the end of the study, people were still trying to beat their scores walking. There's been plenty of studies in the U.S., I think it's in California, where they've given students free bus passes. More students are likely to continue using the bus, they'll buy their own bus pass after the study period. So trying to get young people to sort of change their ways is, or maybe not young people, but if you can encourage travel behavior in a younger age, things are likely to happen. There's likely to continue on. However, that's probably most young people, from what I've gathered, are probably quite actionable when it comes to sort of thinking about the climate. So it's how do we encourage all members of society to think about their travel behaviors, which I think will be a challenge. And in my upcoming book, which I know you'll all be desperate to read and buy, we also discuss the challenges with aviation in terms of frequent flyers and super flyers, etc. as well, and how you can address those challenges, and whether we need to think about a carbon tax when we're interested in that, and all these sort of other factors to sort of disincentivize unsustainable transport methods.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a great presentation after a very early start. So thanks a lot, and we're happy to look forward to what else you bring forward for us in the next. So thank you.
Thank you. And for those interested, my publication list is there, so it will be on the slides.